In compliance with a request of a friend of mine who wrote me from the East, I called on good-natured, guileless old Simon Wheeler and inquired after my friend's friend, Leonidas W. Smiley, as requested to do, and I hereunto append the result. I have a lurking suspicion that Leonidas W. Smiley is a myth, that my friend never knew such a personage, and that he only conjectured that if I asked old Wheeler about him, it would remind him of the infamous Jim Smiley, and he would go to work and bore me nearly to death with some infernal reminiscence of him as long and as tedious as it should be useless to me. If that was his design, it certainly succeeded. I found Simon Wheeler dozing comfortably by the barroom stove of the old dilapidated tavern in the ancient mining cap of Angels, and I noticed that he was fat and bald-headed and had an expression of winning gentleness and simplicity upon his tranquil countenance. He roused up, gave me a good day. I told him a friend of mine had commissioned me to make some inquiries about a cherished companion of his boyhood named Leonidas W. Smiley, Reverend Leonidas W. Smiley, the young minister of the gospel who he had heard was at one time a resident of Angel's Camp. I added that if Mr. Wheeler could tell me anything about this Reverend Leonidas W. Smiley, I would feel under many obligations to him. Simon Wheeler backed me into a corner, blockaded me there with his chair, and then sat down and reeled off the monotonous narrative which follows this paragraph. He never smiled, he never frowned, he never changed his voice from the gentle flowing key to which he tuned the initial sentence. He never betrayed the slightest suspicion of enthusiasm, but all through the interminable narrative there ran a vein of impressive earnestness and sincerity, which showed me plainly that, so far from his imagining there was anything ridiculous or funny about the story, he regarded it as really important matter and admired its two heroes as men of transcendent genius in finesse. To me, the spectacle of a man drifting serenely along through such a queer yarn without ever smiling was exquisitely absurd. As I said before, I asked him to tell me what he knew of Reverend Leonidas W. Smiley, and he replied as follows. I let him go on his own way and never interrupted him once. There was a fella here once by the name of Jim Smiley. In the winter of '49, or maybe it was the spring of '50, I don't recall exactly somehow, though it makes me think it was one or the other because I remember the big flume wasn't finished when he first came to the camp. But anyway, he was the curiousest man about, always betting on anything that turned up you ever see, if he could get anybody to bet on the other side, and if he couldn't, he'd change sides. Anyway, that suited the other man would suit him. Anyway, just so he's got a bet, he was satisfied. But still he was lucky, uncommon lucky. He most always come out winner. He was always ready and laying for a chance. There couldn't be no solitary thing mentioned but that feller'd offer to bet on it and take any side you please. As I was just telling you, if there was a horse race, he'd find him flush, and you'd find him busted at the end of it. If there was a dog fight, he'd bet on it. If there was a cat fight, he'd bet on it. If there was a chicken fight, he'd bet on it. Why, if there was two birds sitting on the fence, he would bet you which one would fly first. Or if there was a camp meeting, he would be there regular to bet on Parson Walker, which he judged to be the best exhorter about here. And so he was, too, and a good man. If he even seen a straddle bug go anywhere, he would bet you how long it would take him to get wherever it was he was going, and you took him up, he would follow that straddle bug to Mexico, but what he would find out, where he was bound for, and how long he was on the road. Lots of the boys here has seen Smiley and can tell you about him. Well, it never made no difference to him. He would bet on anything, and the dangdest feller. Parson Walker's wife laid very sick once for a good while, and it seemed as if they weren't going to save her. But one morning he came in, and Smiley asked how she was, and he said she was considerably better. thanked the Lord for his infinite mercy and coming on so smart that, with the blessing of Providence, she'd get well yet. And Smiley, before he thought, says, "Well, I'll risk 2.5 that she don't, anyway." This year Smiley had a mare. The boys called her the 15-minute nag, but that was only in fun, because, of course, she was faster than that. And they used to win money on that horse, for all she was slow and always had the asthma or the distemper or the consumption or something of that kind. They used to give her 200 or 300 yards start and then pass her underway. But always at the fag end of the race she'd get excited and desperate like, and some cavorting and straddling up and scattering her legs around limber, sometimes in the air, sometimes out one side amongst the fences, and kicked up more dust and more racket with her coughing and sneezing and blowing her nose, and always fetch up at the stand just about a neck ahead as near as you could cipher it down. And he had a small bull pup that to look at him you'd think he weren't worth a cent, but to sit around and look ornery, and lay for a chance to steal something. But as soon as money was up on him, he was a different dog. His underjaw'd pickup stick out like a forecastle on a steamboat, and his teeth would uncover and shine savage like furnaces. And a dog might tackle him and bullyrag him and bite him and throw him over his shoulder 2 or 3 times, and Andrew Jackson, that was the name of the pup, Andrew Jackson would never let on but what he was satisfied, and he hadn't expected nothing else, and the bets being doubled and doubled on the other side all the time, till the money was all up. Then all of a sudden he would grab that other dog just by the joint of his hind leg and freeze to it. Not chaw, you understand, but only just grip and hang on till they throwed up the sponge, if it was a year. Smiley always come out winner on that pup till he harnessed the dog once that didn't have no hind legs, because they'd been sawed off by a circular saw, and when the thing had gone along far enough and the money was all up and he come to make a snatch for his pet Holt, he saw in a minute how he'd been imposed on and how the other dog had him the door, so to speak. And he appeared surprised, and then he looked sort of discouraged like and didn't try no more to win the fight, and so he got shook out bad. He gave Smiley a look as much as to say his heart was broke, and it was his fault for putting up a dog that had no hind legs for him to take hold of, which was his main dependence in the fight. And then he limped off a piece and laid down and died. It was a good pup, was that Andrew Jackson, and would have made a name for himself if he'd lived, for stuff was in him, and he had genius. I know it 'cause I had no opportunity to speak of, and it don't stand to reason that a dog would make such a fight as he could under them circumstances if he had no talent. It always makes me feel sorry when I think of that last fight of his and the way it turned out. Well, this year Smiley had rat terriers and chicken cocks and tomcats and all them kind of things, till you couldn't rest, and you couldn't fetch nothing for him to bet on, but he'd match you. He catched a frog one day and took him home, said he calculated to educate him, and so he never done nothing for 3 months but sit in his backyard and learn that frog to jump. And you bet you he did learn him, too. He'd give him a little punch behind, and the next minute you'd see that frog whirling in the air like a donut, and see him turn up one somerset or maybe a couple, if he got a good start, and come down flat-footed and all right like a cat. He got him up so in the matter of catching flies and kept him in practice so constant that he'd nail a fly every time as far as you could see him. Smiley said all the frog wanted was education, and he could do most anything, and I believe him. Well, I've seen him set Dan'l Webster down on the floor. Dan'l Webster was the name of the frog, and sing out, "Flies, Dan'l, flies," and quicker'n you could wink he'd spring straight up and snake a fly off the counter there, flop down on the floor again as solid as a gob of mud, and fall to scratching the side of his head with his hind foot as indifferent as if he had no idea he'd been doing anything more any frog might do. You never see a frog so modest and straightforward for all he was so gifted, and when it come to fair and square jumping on a dead level, he could get over more ground at one straddle than any animal of his breed you ever see. Jumping on a dead level was his strong suit, you understand, and when it come to that, Smiley would ante up money on him as long as he had a red. Smiley was monstrous proud of his frog, and well he might be, for fellows had traveled and been everywhere, all said he laid over any frog they ever see. Well, Smiley kept the beast in a little lattice box, and used to fetch him downtown sometimes and lay for a bet. One day a feller, a stranger in the camp, who was, come across him with his box and says, "What might it be that you got in the box?" And Smiley says, sort of indifferent like, "It might be a parrot, or it might be a canary, maybe, but it ain't. It's only just a frog." And the fellow took it and looked at it careful and turned around this way and that and says, so 'tis. Well, what's he good for?" "Well," Smiley says, easy and careless, "he's good enough for one thing. I should judge he can outjump any frog Calaveras County." The fellow took the box again and took another long, particular look, gave it back to Smiley and says very deliberate, "Well, I don't see no points about that frog that's any better than any other frog." "Maybe you don't," Smiley says. "Maybe you understand frogs, maybe you don't understand them. Maybe you've had experience, maybe you ain't only an amateur, as it were. Anyways, I've got my opinion, and I'll risk $40 that he can outjump any frog in Calaveras County." And the feller studied a minute, and then says kind of sad like, "Well, I'm only a stranger here, and I ain't got no frog, but if I had a frog, I'd bet on you." And then Smiley says, that's all right. If you'll hold my box a minute, I'll go get you a frog." And so the feller took the box and put up his $40 along with Smiley's and sat down to wait. So he sat there a good while thinking to himself, and then he got the frog out and prized his mouth open, took a teaspoon and filled him full of quail shot, filled him pretty up near to his chin and set him on the floor. Smiley, he went to the swamp and slopped around in the mud for a long time, finally catched the frog, and he fetched him in and gave him to the feller and says, "Now if you're ready, set him alongside of Dan'l with his forepaws just even with Dan'l, and I'll give the word." Then he says, 1, 2, 3, jump, and him and the feller touched up the frogs from behind, and the new frog hopped off, but Dan'l gave a heave and hoisted up his shoulders so like a Frenchman, but it weren't no use. He couldn't budge. He was planted as solid as an anvil, and he couldn't no more stir than if he was anchored out. Smiley was a good deal surprised, and he was disgusted too, but he hadn't have no idea what the matter was, of course. The feller took the money and started away, and when he was going out the door, he sort of jerked his thumb over his shoulders this way at Dan'l and says again very deliberate, "Well, I didn't see no points about that frog that's any better than any other frog." Smiley, he stood scratching his head and looking down at Dan'l a long time, and at last he says, "I do wonder what nation that frog throwed off for. I wonder if it weren't something the matter with him. He appears to be mighty baggy somehow." And he catched up Dan'l by the nape of the neck, lifted it up and says, "Why, blame my cats if he don't weigh 5 pounds, and turned him upside down and belched out a double handful of shot. And then he sees how he was, and he was the maddest man. He set the frog down and took out after the feller, but he never catched him." And here Simon Wheeler heard his name called from the front yard, got up to see what was wanted, turned to me as he moved away, and he said, "Just set where you are, stranger, and rest easy. I aren't going to be gone a second." But by your leave, I did not think that a continuation of the history of the enterprising vagabond, Jim Smiley, would be likely to afford me much information concerning the Reverend Leonidas W. Smiley, and so I started away. At the door I met the sociable Wheeler returning, and he buttonholed me and recommended, "Well, this here Smiley had a yeller one-eyed cow that didn't have no tail, only just a short stump like a banana, and oh, hang Smiley and his afflicted cow," I muttered good-naturedly, and bidding the old gentleman good day, I departed.